For most of history, power followed a simple rule. Own land, command armies, crown a king, and money would follow. Venice broke that rule completely. It had no king, no farmland, no feudal knights guarding borders, no vast countryside feeding an army. Just water, mud, and wooden pilings driven into a lagoon. And yet, for centuries, emperors, popes, crusaders, and kings all depended on Venice. Not for soldiers, but for something far more dangerous. Money, not coins, not gold, but trust. Venice didn't conquer the world, it financed it. And in the process, it quietly invented the financial system we still live inside today. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how Venice became a bank, you first have to understand how strange it was compared to the rest of medieval Europe. Most of Europe was built on land. Land meant farms. Farms meant peasants. Peasants meant food, taxes, and soldiers. Power flowed upward from soil to sword to crown. If you controlled territory, you controlled people. And if you controlled people, you could extract wealth. Venice couldn't play that game. It sat on a lagoon spread across small islands, surrounded by water that was too shallow for large invading ships and too unstable for agriculture. There were no fields to tax, no castles to defend, no cavalry to deploy. Feudalism, the system that defined medieval Europe, simply didn't work there. So, Venice did something radical. Instead of building power on land, it built power on movement, ships instead of fields, contracts instead of castles, ports instead of borders. From the very beginning, Venice survived by connecting other people's economies. Goods from the Islamic world, spices from Asia, silk from China, metals, and wool from Europe all passed through Venetian hands. The city became a hinge between worlds that didn't trust each other, didn't share religions, and often didn't even share currencies. That made Venice valuable, and more importantly, it made Venice necessary. Early on, Venice was loosely tied to the Byzantine Empire. On paper, it acknowledged Byzantine authority. In practice, it behaved more like an independent contractor than a subject. As long as Venice kept trade flowing and ships sailing, Byzantium looked the other way. The turning point came in 1082 when the Byzantine Emperor Alexios III issued a decree that changed everything. Venice was granted sweeping tax exemptions and exclusive trade privileges across the empire in exchange for naval support. This wasn't charity. It was dependence. Byzantium didn't reward Venice because it was weak. It rewarded Venice because it couldn't function without it. From that moment on, Venice stopped paying tribute and started being paid in access. While other cities begged for royal favor, Venice negotiated leverage. It avoided crowns, avoided thrones, and avoided becoming anyone's vassal. There was no king to overthrow, no royal bloodline to manipulate, no single ruler to capture. Venice didn't rule by divine right. It ruled by legal design. And this is where the social order begins to flip. In most of medieval Europe, merchants sat near the bottom of the social ladder. They didn't fight wars. They didn't pray professionally. They made money, which made them useful but morally suspicious. Profit was tolerated, not admired. Power belonged to nobles who owned land and could raise armies. Venice never developed that class structure. There was no landed aristocracy to dominate politics. No feudal lords extracting rents. The people who owned ships, organized trade, and managed risk weren't outsiders trying to climb the social hierarchy. They were the hierarchy. From the start, Venice's elite were merchants, families who understood logistics, capital, and long-term planning. Success didn't come from inherited land. It came from competence, from surviving storms, from honoring contracts, from delivering goods on time across hostile waters. In Venice, economic skill wasn't embarrassing. It was proof of worth. That cultural difference mattered more than any law, because once merchants aren't socially inferior, they don't have to hide their wealth. They don't have to convert it into land or titles to gain legitimacy. They can invest it directly into ships, infrastructure, and institutions. And that's exactly what Venice did. Over time, the most successful trading families became the political class, not through revolution, but through normalization. Governance became something handled by people who already managed complex systems and large sums of money. Decision-making favored stability, predictability, and continuity over glory or conquest. This system hardened in 1297 with a political move known as the Serrata del Maggior Concilio, or closure of the Great Council. Membership in Venice's ruling body was restricted to certain families, not warrior nobles, but long-established merchant houses. Political power became hereditary, yes, but it was hereditary merchant power. Venice didn't create an aristocracy of blood. It created an aristocracy of balance sheets. And here's the crucial point most people miss. Venice didn't see this as corruption. It saw it as protection. Short terms for leaders, complex election systems, layers of councils and committees, severe penalties for overreach. The goal wasn't democracy in the modern sense. It was system stability. Venice didn't trust kings. It didn't trust crowds. It trusted processes. Once merchants ruled, the state itself began to behave differently. It stopped acting like a warlord extracting tribute and started acting like an institution managing risk. The city wasn't just facilitating trade anymore. It was becoming something new. A place where money didn't just circulate. It was organized. Where trust wasn't assumed. It was engineered. Where the state didn't sit above finance. It embedded itself inside it. And that's where the real transformation begins. Because once a government understands that credibility is its most valuable asset, it stops treating money as metal and starts treating it as a system. And Venice was about to turn that system into a machine. Once Venice understood that credibility was its most valuable asset, everything else followed. Most medieval governments treated money like a seasonal tool. They taxed when they could, looted when desperate, and borrowed only when cornered. Debt was a sign of weakness, a last resort when coffers were empty and wars were already going badly. Venice inverted that logic. Instead of borrowing in panic, it borrowed by design. When the state needed funds to build ships, defend trade routes, or wage war, it didn't simply confiscate wealth. It issued what were called prestiti mandatory loans from its wealthiest citizens. On paper, this looked coercive. In practice, it was revolutionary. The state promised regular interest payments. Those claims could be traded. What began as a forced contribution quietly turned into an asset. For the first time, citizens weren't just subjects of the state. They were creditors. And once you hold a government's debt, your incentives change. You want the state to survive? You want stability. You want predictable policy. Chaos stops being romantic and starts being expansive. Venice didn't stumble into this. It understood exactly what it was doing. Debt wasn't a liability. It was a social contract, a way to bind elite wealth directly to the survival of the system itself. The richer you were, the more invested you became in Venice's continuity. Political loyalty wasn't enforced by fear or faith. It was enforced by yield. This was public debt centuries before modern nation-states pretended to invent it. And unlike many later systems, Venice treated that debt seriously. Payments were honored, defaults were avoided. Trust was defended aggressively because once trust breaks, the system collapses faster than any invading army could manage. But debt alone wasn't enough. Venice also needed a way to make money move efficiently without dragging gold across seas infested with pirates, storms, and rival powers. So, Venice did something else radical. It separated money from metal. In 1587, the city established the bank, a state-controlled bank designed not to speculate, but to stabilize. Deposits weren't piles of coins sitting in vaults. They were ledger entries, numbers recorded and transferred through trusted institutions. To a modern viewer, this sounds obvious. To a medieval one, it was borderline heretical. Money had always been physical, tangible, heavy, vulnerable. By turning money into accounting, Venice made it lighter, faster, and safer. Merchants could settle debts without moving a single coin. Fraud dropped. Disputes declined. Trade accelerated. This wasn't innovation for innovation's sake. It was risk management. Venice understood something fundamental. Whoever controls the system people rely on to settle obligations controls the economy itself, not by force but by necessity, and Venice guarded that system obsessively. Speculation was limited. Rules were strict. Punishments were severe. Financial misconduct wasn't treated as cleverness. It was treated as treason. The product Venice was selling to the world wasn't speed or excitement, it was reliability. Venice chose to grow slowly rather than gamble its credibility. It preferred predictable returns over explosive profits. In modern language, it prioritized systemic stability over quarterly gains. Quietly, almost boringly. It worked for centuries. And this is where the story starts to feel uncomfortable. Because the system Venice built never disappeared. It moved. As Venice declined, its ideas migrated to Amsterdam, where merchants refined public debt markets. To London, where the state learned to borrow permanently rather than episodically. To New York, where finance detached even further from fiscal constraints. Different cities, same logic. Today, nations don't dominate because they own the most gold. They dominate because markets believe they will honor their obligations. Government bonds aren't backed by metal. They're backed by confidence. Central banks don't just manage interest rates. They manage belief. When people say the financial system, what they really mean is a network of promises everyone agrees to treat as real. That agreement is fragile. Venice knew this. That's why it enforced discipline. That's why it punished breaches of trust ruthlessly. That's why it kept finance boring on purpose. Modern systems often forget that lesson. Today, debt expands faster than accountability. Risk is privatized when times are good and socialized when things break. Financial credibility is stretched, patched, reassured, and occasionally papered over with new promises. Nothing says stable system quite like needing constant intervention to convince people it still works. Venice would have recognized the danger immediately because it also understood the other side of the equation. Stability has a cost. Over time, Venice's caution hardened into rigidity. Its elites became conservative, protective, and resistant to change. Innovation slowed. New trade routes bypassed the city. The very stability that made Venice powerful eventually made it inflexible. The system survived fight, but the empire stagnated. And that too is part of the lesson. Money systems don't collapse only when they fail. Sometimes they decay when they succeed too well. When preserving the structure becomes more important than adapting it. Venice mastered money by respecting its limits. It failed when it forgot to evolve them. The deeper truth Venice leaves behind is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Money is never neutral. It reflects who is trusted, who is protected, and who absorbs the losses when confidence breaks. Systems built on trust can create extraordinary stability, but only if accountability is real and discipline is enforced. Empires don't fall when they run out of money. They fall when people stop believing the money means anything. Venice didn't conquer the world with armies. It shaped it by organizing incentives better than anyone else alive. It turned trust into infrastructure, debt into loyalty, and finance into governance. And whether we admit it or not, we are still living inside the architecture it designed. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look